that so-and-so was a quality person, and quality leadership was what would save the region from all the kind of pressures that were facing it. And indeed, when Anthony van Vossen started looking at different images we had in the Pacific of the future, he characterized one of those images of the future, linked it to Ron's name, and said it was Asia plus ethical decision-making. That Ron's view about the future was not that it was determined either by culture or by class or by geographical position, but the future, there was room for manoeuvre, there was choice, and it was up to leaders to make the right choices, and they had that choice. And so he put sort of ethical decision-making quite at the heart of his sort of theory about how society worked. Okay. Now, I've said corruption, ethics, opposite sides of the same coin. Ron spelled out his general ethical position in a paper for the 17th Waigani Seminar, which was an important PNG university institution which he created. He said in that, while he never belonged to any religious system, which won't be a surprise to anybody in this audience, he saw ethics constraining the biological tendency to self-interest in favour of the interests of others. And this points out the kind of Ron as, I think, a social scientist, but also a social scientist with a strong sense of sort of biology underlying that, a sort of early sociobiologist, in a sense, who saw us as all human beings, but driven by certain characteristics of our human nature. And he said he was also a realist in this understanding of corruption, or of ethics, particularly about the effects of power, saying religious and value systems particularly serve the interests of those with power who can generally interpret the rules in situations of doubt. Okay? So whatever the religious and value systems tended on the margin to be supportive of those who have the power to interpret the rules, and those are some of the questions that Howard and Mutaba have also been talking about. And that while no ethical system can stop all the excesses of the powerful, they can constrain and channel them. Almost any ethical system is better than none. Okay, well, what more? Some more concluding points then. How can we? If I'm saying that one of Ron's sort of principles was the notion of quality individuals and the fact that they mattered, and that some people weren't quality in a sense, but some people were, and comparisons were often made by different kinds of leaders throughout the region. What does this tell you about what's good and bad, or how can we fit into a bigger picture of what's good and bad? And the literature on corruption and ethics invites us to sort of think about three ways in which things like corruption can be bad. They're first bad because they violate a rule. Okay? There is a law that says you should declare your income, you break the law, you don't, that's bad. Okay? The second is things are bad because of their consequences. That we don't try and enforce rules, but we say, look, that you're behaving badly because it has bad consequences for you or other people. And then the third one, which I think is relevant to Ron particularly, is the idea that things are bad when they show the absence of personal virtue, a very old idea, a sort of Greek idea, also a Christian idea, an idea that's been under pressure recently, that is also bubbling back a bit as we see the limits of other kinds of ways of thinking ethically. The idea that something's bad because it breaks the rule, can be either a formal rule or an informal rule, is a tricky one to apply in the Pacific Islands, because one of the things that we've talked about in the early part of this session is in Pacific Islands there are often several competing possible rules that apply. So appealing to a rule is not going to resolve things. If you appeal to the rule that you should be good to your kin and help your family, that may be in contradiction to the rule that you should follow the public service procedure or serve the public interest. So an ethics relying on rules, a sort of Ten Commandments kind of ethics in relation to corruption, seems to me to get immediately tricky in a Pacific context where numbers of rules are operating. The second one, that things are judged bad, like corruption, by their consequences, is much more the sort of current international view. It's the view of aid donors and a view of economists who weren't particularly worried about the breaking of the rules 20 or 30 years ago, because often if you're an economist then you thought, well, if the system is over-regulated, maybe a bit of corruption does no harm because it gets things going and so on. It puts prices into the system which weren't there before. Now economists are much more hostile to corruption, because they see the consequences of corruption in terms of lack of foreign investment, lack of domestic investment. And political scientists also see the consequence of corruption as bad because it reduces the legitimacy of governments and people no longer trust or believe in government. But the third approach is close to Ron's emphasis on quality individuals. It talks of virtue rather than rules or consequences. Virtue is an individual personal quality. Honesty, for example, is a virtue. The New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption, which I teach courses with, their law defines corruption in terms of dishonesty and partiality. These are personal virtues. Okay? And there's a whole list of these in the leadership literature. And in the region I mentioned Vanuatu's first Ombudsman, Commissioner, and in her reports on bad behaviour amongst Vanuatu politicians, she wasn't so much concerned about their breaking the rules, because often the rules were unclear or unspecified, or there were no rules about the thing. She wasn't really concerned with the consequences. She honed in on the absence of virtue of politicians, the absence of individual qualities, of honesty and so on. Now we might hope that people... I'll just add one more Pacific philosopher to that, of course, Commodore Bainimarama, in his arguments about what's wrong in Fiji, and his talk about corruption in Fiji, which I've been writing a bit about, also emphasises this virtue question. The previous leaders were not virtuous people. It wasn't simply they broke the law, that they're trying to show they did that. It wasn't simply that their corruption had bad consequences, but it was something to do with personal qualities of leaders. Okay, now we might hope to conclude that people would behave honestly, not merely because there were rules about it or because the consequences of dishonesty are bad. However, some philosophers argue that rule and consequence-based approaches to ethics can't provide a compelling reason why we should obey the rules and avoid the consequences, especially if we can stand to gain personally and get away with it. And virtue finds that compelling reason in the achievement of personal happiness through leading a good life. It's a very old Greek idea, but a very one that's coming back a lot in some ethical thinking, as Ron did. Personal characteristics such as honesty and trustworthiness are, in this view, not given or determining of how we should behave in all circumstances. For example, you can't inherit what Ron called quality. Okay. You achieve this as the result of leading a good, reflective, prudent life. Reflective and prudent. And Ron's personal simplicity, which we've come back to quite often, not liking big hotel rooms, not building huge houses, leading a personal and simple life, and also his intense reflectiveness about what he saw around him. Ron's characteristic method was not the standard academic one of let's read the literature and see what it says. It was what was he thinking about the last person he talked to and the number of people he talked to sort of inductively find out what was really going on. So, there's a debate about the possibility of these days whether virtue is enough, whether in a kind of, if a sort of age in which Christianity is on the wane, whether the notion of a purposeful life contains much to say to people who don't believe that life has a purpose. In a famous book by Alistair McIntyre called After Virtue, wonders how we can behave ethically. It seems to be in Ron's notions of quality and quality individuals. We have somebody speaking very much the language of virtue. And it seems to be also virtue ethics, the ethics of saying to people, what you're doing is bad, not simply because it's breaking the rules or simply because it's bad consequences, but it's bad for you, okay, in the long run, may be particularly relevant to leaders, because they're the people who are in a position to make the rules and exempt themselves, and of course don't often suffer the consequences. So virtue may be all we have in dealing with leaders, and Ron certainly was a pioneer in the idea that individuals had qualities achieved through lifetimes, not simply inherited or trained into them. Chiefliness sometimes seems to be, when we're talking about it in a very positive way, has this quality of acquired virtue rather than inherited good. So those are the ethics side of Ron's interest in corruption. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about that.